Mr. President, have you spoken to Senator Mitch McConnell since his hospitalization?
No.
How's he doing? Do you have any
I have no idea how he's doing.
MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell has been on top of this story. Charlie is still with us. Michael, this is now bipartisan. Does that change things?
It could, Alicia. It could certainly put some pressure on his office to release more information or just simply say what brought him into the hospital and why he is still there right now. But up until this point, we have not gotten that kind of information. Where things stand right now are not very different from when I spoke to you yesterday. And it's because we still have not gotten any updates from Senator McConnell's office. What we do know is that Senate Majority Leader John Thune and the second highest ranking Senate Republican John Barrasso, they both said that they spoke with McConnell earlier this week. They had about 20-minute phone calls each. They spoke about a number of topics, but still no update on his condition. Yesterday, there was that letter from Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky asking McConnell's office for more information. And now, as you mentioned, we are hearing from some Republicans who say they really don't know what's going on with him. And there is.
All right, friends. Mockler here, and the news isn't good. Trump publicly refused to endorse Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell in an interview, a stunning break that signals deep fractures within the party. No vote of confidence, no reassurance, just a flat refusal and a statement that there are disagreements. It's a moment that will be studied by political historians for years. That's it. That's all it took. The President of the United States, the head of the Republican Party, the man who controls the bully pulpit like nobody else in modern history, declined to back the man who controls the entire Republican Senate agenda. And I want you to really think about what that means. This isn't a Democrat attacking the president. This isn't the media manufacturing a controversy out of nothing. This is the sitting president publicly weakening his own party's legislative leader.
Some concern. You just spoke about Marlin Stutzman. I also want to show you some comments from Brett Guthrie. He is a Republican who represents part of Kentucky in the House of Representatives. He said he's texted with McConnell, but there's still some question about what that actually means. Take a listen.
This isn't a voice communication, and you haven't seen him.
Well, I haven't talked to him personally.
So how do you know that the texts themselves are actually coming from the man?
Well, I don't. I've never known anybody to text for him when we text back and forth. So I just absolutely assume that it's from him. So I'm going to be fine. That's what I got back, the response. And I've talked to people on his staff and I haven't directly talked to him, but I understood he talked to John Thune yesterday or the day before. My understanding, Barrasso and some others. I do believe he's going to recover, and I hope he's back and watching this. We need him back.
Now, Alicia, the fact that we are discussing and debating whether or not a text from somebody's phone number is actually a text from them, I think speaks volumes about the place we're in right now when it comes to Senator McConnell's condition. One more thing I'll leave you with. We've gotten the first indication of some questions or some pressure, rather, for Senator McConnell to potentially step aside and resign. There's a new tweet out from Congresswoman Nancy Mace, the Republican from South Carolina. She writes on X, quote,
at the exact moment when that party is trying to gear up for elections that could determine control of the entire government. This is an internal Republican civil war playing out in real time, right in front of the American people, and almost nobody is talking about it the way they should be. The phrase that was used toward the end of the speech, but without referencing the Capitol, among the parts cut out was a section where the president said he wanted supporters to demonstrate peacefully. In a letter to staff, a senior official said, there have been some mistakes made, and as Director General, responsibility has to be taken. The official stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with them. But the official also made one thing very clear, that the organization is not institutionally biased.
If McConnell is in as bad a shape as Biden ever was, or worse, he needs to step aside. The charade can't continue. We can't demand of others what we won't demand of ourselves. So we are, Alicia, coming up on that 1 month mark since Mitch McConnell was brought to the hospital. Again, still no word on his condition and what brought him there in the first place, but certainly the bipartisan pressure for more information, very much so, rising right now.
Charlie, is it telling that the president didn't make it onto Mitch McConnell's call list?
Well, yes, obviously, Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump have not been on speaking terms, I think, for some time. But, just I hate having to agree with Nancy Mace here, but if we're going to have a gerontocracy, I think the minimal standard should be a little bit of transparency. If we're going to have people who are in their 80s, who are in, either in the presidency, in the Senate, or on the U.S. Supreme Court, I think the minimal thing that we could expect, the obligation, is to tell us whether they are still alive, what their condition is, whether they are ever going to come back and be able to do their duties. We've just seen so many of these.
And that's why it's considered the world's most trusted news provider. The president welcomed the resignations, commenting on social media that the way the speech had been edited was an attempt to step on the scales of a presidential selection. He called that on the national stage, and it matters for a lot of reasons. Not just as a political drama story, but as a signal about how the Republican Party actually functions and whether it's capable of holding itself together when the pressure gets serious. So let's walk through all of this, because there's more here than the headline suggests. There are layers upon layers of political maneuvering, strategic calculation, and genuine institutional tension that most people are completely missing.
And quite frankly, cover-ups of the condition. And this notion that somehow someone got a text from Mitch McConnell's number so that we should take that seriously. No, I think that right now, given everything that we have gone through over the last few years, that the voters have every right to say, no, we want some proof of life. We want some actual information. And I think that that is a moral and political obligation of the offices, including of the office of the president, of Supreme Court justices, senators, and members of Congress, who, by the way, we've had a number of them just simply vanish from the face of the earth, and nobody knows where they are. Look, as long as they're working for the taxpayers and allegedly representing, the American public, we have the right to know, and I think the obligation to know, whether they are still compos mentis or around.
Well, Mike, I've got about 30 seconds left. I think that Charlie's point is especially true because this is about to affect the legislative process.
Yeah, that's right. Senator McConnell notably sits on the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is going to be very key.
The fight between the president and the Senate leader is not new. It has been building for months, escalating in ways that are increasingly visible to anyone paying attention. But it has now reached a point where it's spilling out into public view in ways that cannot be ignored. At the center of this conflict is a very specific piece of legislation and a very specific Senate rule that has become a flashpoint for everything that's wrong with this relationship. The president has been pushing hard for Senate Republicans to pass a particular voting-related bill. He's been demanding it, pressuring members, making it a major priority. And here's where things get complicated.
As we get closer to that September 30th government funding deadline, there is a potential shutdown that could transpire. It's a conversation we have every single year up on Capitol Hill. If the Senate Appropriations Committee tries to advance any of those spending bills, and they do fall along party lines, if McConnell isn't there to vote, it means that the committee would be deadlocked. And on Capitol Hill, a tie fails, which means that we are coming up to a point where McConnell's absence could be a real problem for Republicans, for the legislative process, for the funding of the government overall. So right now, it's sort of a question of, well, when will he come back? What's his condition? But we are getting closer to a point, Alicia, where it could be, well, actually, what can we do or not do if he's not here to actually cast a vote?
The Senate has what's called the filibuster, a rule that means most legislation needs significantly more votes than a simple majority to advance. The math is brutal, and it doesn't change no matter how much pressure gets applied. Republicans hold a majority of Senate seats. That sounds like a lot, but it is not enough to overcome the filibuster. So, to pass this legislation, Republicans either need some votes from the other side, which is not happening, or they need to change the Senate rules and eliminate the filibuster. And the Senate leader has said repeatedly, clearly, publicly, and consistently that the votes are not there. Not to pass the bill through regular order, not to change the filibuster rules. The votes simply do not exist among Republican senators to do what the president is demanding. And that tension between what the president wants and what the Senate leader says is possible is at the heart of everything that's happening right now between these two men. What we're watching is a clash between two very different visions of how the Republican Party should operate. On the president's side, the argument is simple and powerful. Republicans have a majority. They should use it. If Senate rules are getting in the way of passing the agenda Republicans ran on, change the rules. That's what power is for. On the Senate leader's side, the argument is also simple and has its own logic. Senate traditions and rules exist for a reason. Not every Republican senator is on board with blowing up the filibuster and trying to force a vote you're going to lose, or trying to pressure senators into changing institutional rules they don't want to change, is a recipe for visible failure and internal chaos right before an election. Both arguments have logic behind them, but they are fundamentally incompatible. And the fact that the president just publicly refused to back his Senate leader tells you that this fight is not being resolved quietly behind the scenes. It's out in the open. And November is getting closer every single day. Now let's slow this all the way down and really dig into each layer of what's happening here, because there are several moving pieces, and you need to understand all of them to see the full picture. We need to start with the legislation itself and the filibuster fight, because this is the actual substantive disagreement. The thing that the president and the Senate leader are fighting over. And you need to understand why it's so stuck. This legislation is voting related, and the president has made it a major priority. He wants it passed. He's been pushing for it loudly and consistently. The challenge is the math inside the Senate chamber. On paper, the Republican majority looks comfortable, but the Senate filibuster means that for most legislation, not budget reconciliation bills, but most regular legislation, you need significantly more votes to cut off debate and move to a final vote. Republicans don't have that many votes. That's a significant gap. And in the current political environment, finding enough senators from the other side willing to vote for Republican voting legislation is simply not happening. So the only path to passing this legislation through regular order is either finding votes that don't exist or changing the Senate rules. And that's where the Senate leader keeps hitting the wall. Because eliminating the filibuster, or even carving out an exception to it for this specific bill, requires Republican senators to vote for that rule change. And the leader says he does not have those votes either. He says there are Republican senators who are not willing to go along with killing the filibuster. Senators who have institutional concern about what happens when the other party eventually takes back the majority and has no filibuster standing in its way. Those senators are not wrong to have that concern. They've seen history. They know how the pendulum swings. But it means the path the president is demanding simply doesn't exist right now inside the Republican Senate caucus. And that's the cold, hard reality that's driving all of this tension. Now let's talk about what the president refusing to back his Senate leader actually means in practical terms. This is important to understand because the Senate leader holds enormous institutional power. He became Senate Majority Leader, the person who controls the floor, sets the agenda, decides what comes up for a vote and when, manages the day-to-day legislative operation of the Republican-controlled Senate. That's an enormous amount of institutional power. And the relationship between a Senate Majority Leader and the president of the same party is one of the most important relationships in American government. When it works, when the president and the Senate leader are aligned and working together, you can move legislation, confirm nominees, and build toward a coherent agenda. When it breaks down, when the president is publicly declining to endorse the Senate leader, when there are public disagreements and public tensions, everything gets harder. Nominees get held up, legislation stalls, Republicans publicly disagree with each other in front of voters who are trying to figure out whether this party is capable of governing. And multiple sources have reported that the split has been widening, not just over this specific legislation, but also in the context of the president's effort to remove a senior senator in a primary. Multiple Republican senators have told reporters privately that the infighting is a real liability in what is already going to be a difficult election environment. These are not liberal commentators saying this. These are Republican senators saying privately that their own party's internal civil war is a problem they don't know how to fix before November. Let's talk about the election context, because this fight is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening roughly 3 months before elections that could determine control of Congress, and Republican senators are watching it very carefully and with a lot of anxiety. Here's the basic political reality of midterm elections. The party that controls the White House historically tends to lose seats in midterm elections. That's a well-documented historical pattern. It doesn't happen every single time, but it happens enough that it's the default expectation. So going into November, Republicans are already facing a structural headwind just based on historical patterns. And on top of that structural headwind, they now have a visible and public split between the president and their Senate leader. The president has reportedly told political publications that voters may be frustrated with Republicans generally, but he's also argued that any frustration is not personally aimed at him. That framing is interesting, because if the Republicans underperform in November, if they lose seats or lose their majority, that framing sets up a very specific blame game. The president would be positioned to say, voters were frustrated with the Senate leadership, not with me. And Senate Republicans who went along with the president's agenda would be positioned to say, we followed the president's lead and it didn't work. Nobody ends up owning the outcome. Everybody ends up pointing at somebody else. And that dynamic, that pre-built blame game, is itself a sign of how much tension exists inside this party right now. And there's one more thread in this story that deserves serious attention, because it reveals a lot about how the political positioning around this fight is already being set up ahead of November. The president has reportedly told political publications that voters may be frustrated with Republicans generally, but he also argued that their frustration is not personally aimed at him. Let's sit with that for a second, because that framing is doing a lot of work politically. What the president is essentially doing is prepositioning himself for a potential bad outcome in November. If Republicans lose seats, if they lose their Senate majority, the president has already begun building the argument that the frustration was with congressional Republicans, not with the president. That's not an accident. That's a calculated posture that insulates the president from blame if things go wrong, while leaving Senate Republicans exposed. And Senate Republicans know exactly what that framing means. They've heard it before. They've seen what happens when a bad election result gets attributed to the congressional party rather than to the president who was pushing the agenda the party ran on. It creates exactly the kind of blame game that tears parties apart after losses where nobody owns the outcome. Everybody points at everybody else, and the party spends months or years relitigating what went wrong instead of rebuilding and planning for the next fight. Republican senators heading into November are very aware of this dynamic, and the fact that the president is already using language that sets up that blame shift is one more thing making them nervous. There's also a broader principle at stake here that's worth taking seriously, because what the president is really asking for, when you strip away the specific legislation and the specific rule, is a different kind of Senate. He wants a Senate that functions more like the House of Representatives. The House passes things on simple majorities. The majority leader controls the floor. Things move when the majority wants them to move. The Senate is deliberately designed to be different. It is deliberately designed to slow things down, to require broader consensus, to give the minority some ability to force debate, to make it harder to pass major legislation on simple party line votes. The filibuster is the main tool that makes the Senate, rather than a second House of Representatives. And there is a genuine philosophical debate about whether that design still serves its original purpose or whether it has become a tool of pure obstruction. That is a real debate. Reasonable people disagree on it. But what makes it especially complicated right now is that Senate Republicans who don't want to eliminate the filibuster are not being disloyal to the president out of spite. They're making a calculation that the institutional rules they're preserving today are rules they will need when the other party takes back the majority. And the other party will take back the majority at some point. That's just the nature of political cycles. And in that future moment when Republicans are in the minority, they will be very glad they kept the filibuster. That's the Senate leader's position. That's why he keeps saying, the votes aren't there because a significant number of his own members are quietly making that same long-term calculation. Now let's talk about what's happening between the president and another senior senator, because it matters here. The president has reportedly been working to support a primary challenger against one of the most senior Republicans in the Senate, the man who is the Senate leader's chief rival for the majority leader job. The president going after a senior senator in a primary is a significant escalation. It sends a signal to every other Republican senator that disagreeing with the president on legislative priorities can have a personal political cost, a primary challenge, a withdrawal of support, a public rebuke. That kind of pressure is real, but it also creates exactly the kind of visible internal Republican chaos that the Senate leader and other party leaders are warning about. Primary fights within the Republican caucus consume money, attention, and goodwill that would otherwise go toward defeating the other party in the general election. And when those primary fights are being driven by the president of the party himself against the party's own senior senators, it creates a dynamic where Republican senators are spending political energy defending themselves from their own president, rather than making the case for the Republican agenda to swing voters. That's not a winning election formula, and a lot of Republican senators know it. They understand that every dollar spent on a primary fight is a dollar not spent on defeating the other party. Every negative story about internal Republican conflict is a story that doesn't get written about Democratic vulnerabilities. Every day spent defending against attacks from the president is a day not spent building a case for Republican governance. Let's bring it all home now, because there are several key takeaways from this story that you need to understand. This is not a story that's going away before November. In fact, it's going to get louder and more intense as the elections get closer. First, the president's public refusal to back his Senate leader is a significant escalation that changes the political dynamics inside the Republican Senate. This is not business as usual. Presidents of a party routinely back the leaders of their party in Congress, even when they disagree with them on specific things. It is part of how you keep the party unified, keep the legislative machinery functioning, and signal to voters that your party can actually govern. When the president declines to back his Senate leader and says publicly that he has disagreements with him, he is doing the opposite. He is publicly weakening the man who controls the Republican Senate agenda. Every Republican senator saw that interview. Every one of them now knows that the president is not standing behind the Senate leader, and that changes the internal calculus for those senators when they're deciding how to vote. How hard to push back against the president's demands, and how much institutional cover the leader has when he says the votes aren't there. If the Senate leader doesn't have the president's backing, does he still have the authority to manage the caucus? Does he still have the credibility to make deals? Does the caucus hold together? Those are not hypothetical questions right now. Those are the actual questions sitting in Republican senators' minds as they head into November. The filibuster fight is a genuine strategic disagreement with real long-term consequences, and it's not going to be resolved by pressure alone. The president wants the filibuster gone, or at least carved out, so the legislation can pass on a simple Republican majority. The Senate leader says the votes aren't there. And here's the important thing. The Senate leader is not wrong about the vote count. This isn't spin. Republican senators who don't want to eliminate the filibuster have a concrete and defensible reason for that position. They know the other party will eventually be back in the majority. They know that in that moment, when the other party controls the Senate, they will want every procedural tool available to slow things down, force debate, and protect minority rights. The filibuster is that tool, and senators who vote to kill it today are senators who have given it up permanently for themselves and for their party the next time they're in the minority. That calculation is not disloyalty to the president. That is basic, long-term political self-preservation. The president's argument that you should use power when you have it and worry about the future when it comes is also a real argument. It has a coherent logic. When you have the majority, you use it. You pass the things you promise to pass, you deliver for your voters. And if the rules are standing in the way of that, you change the rules. That's the president's position, and it has genuine appeal to Republican-based voters who are tired of watching their party win elections and then fail to deliver. But it's an argument that requires getting the votes. And right now, the votes are not there. No amount of pressure from the president changes that math unless individual Republican senators actually decide to change their positions. And the senators who are holding out are not doing so because they're confused or disloyal. They're doing so because they've run the calculation and they don't like the outcome. They're looking at a future Democratic majority, which will come eventually, as it always does. And they're deciding they want the filibuster intact when that day arrives. That is a real position with real logic. And the Senate leader's job is to count those votes honestly, not to tell the president what he wants to hear. And that's exactly what he's been doing, which is why the president is angry with him, and which is why the votes still aren't there. The election timing makes all of this more dangerous for Republicans than it would be in any other year. Internal party conflicts are survivable when you have time to work through them, find compromises, and present a unified front before voters go to the polls. 3 months is not a lot of time. And what Republican senators are looking at right now as they head into the fall campaign season is a president who is publicly at war with their Senate leader, who is reportedly trying to primary one of their senior members, and who has publicly floated that voters might be frustrated with Republicans generally, while insisting the frustration isn't aimed at him personally. That last part is the tell, because the moment a party leader starts managing expectations about who will get blamed if things go badly, you know that somewhere inside the operation, people are already running scenarios about losing. The argument from the other side heading into November basically writes itself. If Republicans can't get along with each other, if their president won't back their own Senate leader, how are they going to deliver for the American people? That argument lands with swing voters. It lands with people who aren't deeply tribal and who are trying to figure out which party is actually capable of governing. The visible split gives the other side a gift that has nothing to do with policy. It's a competence argument, and it's free. The deeper question this story raises is about the long-term relationship between the president and the Senate as an institution. And this question is not going to be answered before November. It's going to play out over months and possibly years. The president's approach to the Senate, pushing hard for his agenda, demanding loyalty, going after members who don't fall in line, is consistent with how he has operated his entire political career. It has produced results in some cases. It has produced chaos in others. What makes this moment different is the scale of what's being asked. Eliminating the filibuster is not a small procedural tweak. It is a fundamental change to how the Senate operates, a change that would reshape American legislative politics for decades. And Republican senators who are resisting that change are not just resisting one bill. They're resisting a structural transformation of the institution they serve in. That's a different kind of disagreement than a policy dispute over a tax rate or a spending level. And the fact that the president is publicly at war with his own Senate leader over this, rather than working the problem quietly behind the scenes, suggests that the quiet diplomacy approach has already been tried and has already failed. What you're seeing in public is what happens after the private conversations haven't worked. And that tells you how serious and how stuck this disagreement really is. There's also a broader signal embedded in the president's public posture here. When a president chooses to take a fight with his own Senate leader into the open, when he declines to endorse the person who controls his legislative agenda on national television, he's making a choice. He's choosing pressure over partnership. He's choosing public confrontation over behind-the-scenes negotiation. That choice may be calculated to shake loose the votes he needs. It may be a genuine expression of frustration with a legislative process that isn't moving fast enough. It may be both. But the effect of that choice, regardless of the intent, is to publicly signal to the entire Senate Republican caucus that the president does not fully trust or back their leader. And once that signal is out there, it doesn't disappear. It hangs over every subsequent conversation, every vote count, every legislative negotiation. That's the environment Senate Republicans are now operating in. And that's what they have to navigate between now and November. Here's where we land. The interview dropped. The president declined to back his Senate leader, said he has disagreements, said he doesn't want to get into it. And with that, one of the most important political relationships in the Republican Party went public in the worst possible way at the worst possible time. 3 months before November, with the filibuster fight still unresolved, with the legislation still stalled, with a senior senator watching his back in Texas, with Republican senators telling reporters privately that the infighting is a liability they don't know how to fix, and with the president already deploying language that could set up a post-November blame shift if things go badly in the elections. Trump's refusal to endorse McConnell has blown the party's internal tension into the open just months before the midterms. Now, every Republican must decide how to navigate the fracture. The clock is ticking, and the country is watching to see if the party can hold together or tear itself apart.